let's take just a minute to think about some artists that came along in the 1980s, but who based their sound on earlier styles. Maybe the first one that we can think about with regard to that is a group out of Australia called AC/DC. Now, to those who just discovered AC/DC through listening to classic rock radio in the last decade or two, you might have thought that AC/DC would be best grouped with bands like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin and groups like that from the first half of the 70s. But as it turns out, AC/DC didn't have their first big hits in the United States until 1979. That is, until groups like Led Zeppelin weren't even performing or recording anymore. Highway to Hell, a number 17 album for them. But then tragedy strikes and singer Bon Scott dies, is replaced by Brian Johnson. But the band, strange as it may seem, does not seem to miss a beat. The album Back in Black from 1981 goes to number 4 in the album. The group, as I say, a kind of a look back or a continuation of the tradition of blues rock with the kind of Robert Plant influenced kind of vocals, maybe a little bit scratchier, it must be admitted, than Robert Plant's vocals, but very similar to that. And with a guitar hero at the center, Angus Young, who decided that his image would be of a schoolboy, right? So he's wearing a schoolboy uniform, sometimes with a backpack, and then playing this Gibson SG guitar. And he became a real kind of, Jimmy Page-like figure, but a very sort of unlikely looking Jimmy Page-like figure for AC/DC. Again, they became one of the staple acts of rock radio in the 80s, videos on MTV, of course. One of the groups that during those first couple of years, the first year and a half when MTV was really focusing on the middle-class white audience in the Midwest, this would have been the kind of video that they would have really sort of wanted to have, because that's what those kids would have really gone for. A little bit later in the decade, we get a group out of San Francisco called Huey Lewis and the News. Here's a group who are different because they're so easy rocking, sunny, and wholesome in terms of their approach. In fact, their number 3 hit from 1986 kind of says it all. The name of the song is Hip to Be Square. Those of you who've raised kids in the United States and who know something about the show Sesame Street may remember the Muppets doing a version of this called It's Hip to Be a Square, which is all about squares. not square people, like square geometrical figures. The group really gets its start when their song The Power of Love is a number 1 hit in 1985 because it's featured in the movie Back to the Future. And of course, Back to the Future was a big movie in its day, and this song was very much featured in it. So Huey Lewis and the News, maybe a kind of return to a kind of old-fashioned good time. There's nothing sexually aggressive or predatory about the band. There's nothing that has to do too much with unhappiness or discomfort or protest or rebellion. It's just fun, good time music that should put a smile on your face. Let's take a look now at Blue Eyed Soul and some of what was happening with that music during the 1980s. And again, as all these bands we're talking about this week, all of them sort of in rotation on MTV and coming to people that way increasingly as the decade unfolds. The first one to think about is Hall & Oates. These guys were from Philadelphia. And in fact, Hall of Hall & Oates had worked with Gamble and Huff as part of the Philadelphia sound in the 1970s. Their vocal approach was strongly influenced by 1960s and 70s black styles. They were sort of the 70s version of the Righteous Brothers, or the 70s version of Three Dog Night, or the late 70s version of Three Dog Night, because Three Dog Night was still active in the first half of the 1970s pretty much. They had some pretty big hits in the second half of the 70s. Sarah Smile was number 4 in 1976. Rich Girl was number 1 in 1977. Maybe more of an AM band than an FM band. You could hear their music sometimes on FM rock, but they were maybe much bigger on AM. But with 1981, They have this album, a number 5 album called Private Eyes, which has a number 1 hit, Private Eyes, and another number 1 hit called I Can't Go For That, which really makes Hall & Oates into a real staple of the first half of the decade in terms of this blue-eyed soul sound. That is, white guys doing music that's very strongly influenced by black pop soul of the 60s and the 70s. There are 2 other artists that probably should be mentioned in this connection with kind of different career trajectories and way things worked out for them. The first is George Michael from the UK, originally a member of the band Wham! With the other guy in Wham! Was Andrew Ridgeley. Just to give you an idea of how cruel the popular music business can be, it wasn't too long ago that a trivia question on a television show I saw was, who was the other guy in Wham? If you knew it was Andrew Ridgeley, you won the prize. That's great for George Michael, but Andrew Ridgeley, not so much. But at one time, Wham! Was a very, very big group. Their album from 1984 was number 1, Make It Big, it was called. Not their first album, but the first album to make it big here in the United States, featuring 3 number 1 hits, Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, Careless Whisper, and Everything She Wants. George Michael went on as a solo artist to have an even bigger album in 1987, a number 1 album, Faith, which had 4 number 1 hits plus 2 more top 5 hits, all in this kind of blue-eyed soul kind of sound, kind of vocal approach. George Michael had a lot of crossover success on R&B charts in this country. That is, black listeners were buying his music as much as white listeners were buying his music, and so there was a real kind of crossover with him. Not so much with the next artist we're going to talk about, and that's Michael Bolton, hailing from New Haven, Connecticut. His music also has strong debts to 1960s soul, and he did a bunch of covers that really sort of to show that, though he didn't do all covers. In fact, he only did a few covers, but the covers do show his indebtedness to this earlier music. Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was a number 11 hit from him, of course, his version of a song originally done by Otis Redding. And in 1991, getting a little bit ahead of our story, he did his version of Percy Sledge's When a Man Loves a Woman, and that went to number 1 in the charts in the early 1990s. Maybe the big album for him, Soul Provider, that came from 1990, a number 3 album. But like I say, Michael Bolton was on TV a lot. A lot of white listeners really knew his style. They really knew his records. He was everywhere, but didn't really have the same kind of reverse crossover appeal for whatever reason that George Michael had a few years earlier. So let's now turn to a topic that is frequently overlooked by people who think about the 1980s. At the end of the 1970s, a lot of the bands who had been popular during the 70s, during that decade, even coming out of the 1960s, they were thought of as kind of dinosaurs. They should maybe go away, and maybe younger people should come in, young blood should come in to take it over. But what actually turns out is a lot of those rock dinosaurs not only adapted, but thrived, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video.